Hello class, welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about two painters, probably the two most influential painters in our time period, 20th century art. We're talking about Paul Cézanne and Pablo Picasso. Now it's important for you to not only know who these guys are and what they did, but it's also going to be important for you to know how they were important. Both of them played very different roles in this burgeoning art market, and both of them represent a new kind of painter for the day. And so as we look at each of them, I'm going to be highlighting kind of what made them stand out from the rest of the people that they were in the community with. So we're going to start off with Paul Cézanne because he comes first, and then we're going to go into Pablo Picasso. I did kind of jump the gun when I showed you the Fauves last week, and so we're going back in time first, because Cézanne was before Henri Matisse, and then Pablo Picasso comes right around the same time. So there's a lot happening. For a small town like Paris, there's a lot happening. Alright, so in 1870, Paul Cézanne made this painting. It's called A Modern Olympia. And as you can see, you have a male figure with his little dog near foot, and he is looking at the representation of a white nude female that is being uncloaked by a black female who looks like she might also be nude. I've seen this work in person. It's impossible to decipher whether or not that other figure is clothed or not clothed. But I do know that the white woman in the center of the frame is unclothed. That's the point of the work. I hope that immediately this brings this painting back into your minds. So this is Edouard Manet's Olympia from 1863, 7 years earlier. And remember when I talked about this work that this one received widespread attention. It was refused by the Salon, but it was retained by the Academy and put on at the Salon de Refusés, which was the Salon of Garbage. And there it was ridiculed by critics, by the audience. It was heralded by painters, Paul Cézanne being one of them, who was friends with Edouard Manet at the time. This work was revolutionary, and I already talked about that, and so I hope that this is kind of well-worn territory. But you know, it was shocking that you had this this woman in the frame looking directly out at the viewer, that kind of counteracting the gaze of the male viewer. See my hand? It's attacking the viewer, right? But the other thing that was really important, and this is what Cézanne latches onto, is the fact that Edouard Manet did not hide the fact that he was making a painting of the human form. He was very flat. He didn't mix his colors as well as he could have. He didn't really care about paying attention to how this figure was modeled, how she kind of filled out three-dimensional space, or the illusion of three-dimensional space. For Manet, it was important that his audience understood that they were looking at a painting of a female figure. Because for a long time, artists had this perception that they were making windows into another world. That's how painting is, before this time period, is dealt with. It's a window into a world, so it's this like little, like this, you know. My face, my little talking face, is actually a window into another world. You're seeing a video recording of me in this space talking to you, right? But Manet was making a painting, so it was, you know, a flat surface stretched on these little boards with pigment on it. This is a painting that my sister-in-law made me, so that was a very important thing for Manet to convey. That was a very important thing that Cézanne picked up and Cézanne would play with. But first, let's look at this kind of work. So when I say that Manet refused to model the figure, refused to make her feel as though she had actual physical weight, this is what I mean. This figure, Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres, Grand Odalisque, she has been modeled with all academic precision that can be afforded. She looks as though, when you see this in real life, she looks as though she actually has some weight to her, that she could get up and move around the way that I am moving around in this video. You know, it was this perception that she was real and that we had just captured a moment of her laying down, but it was very real. Manet was not interested in that. His reality came in the weight of the paint. It was more important for him that his viewers understood that he was using paint to make an illusion of what this woman was. He was giving the audience what they wanted, which was the image of a nude woman, but he was rendering it in oil and pigment, not in this fictive reality, the one that Ingres is so interested in conveying. Alright, that stuff over. Let's look back at a modern Olympia. The one thing that I find kind of problematic with the way Gompertz deals with this work is he, like a lot of historians, want to believe that what we actually see here is the scene that was set up by Edouard Manet. We see the scene of a gentleman who has come into the room with his odalisque, with his courtesan, that's the word I'm blanking on. He's in the actual room with this courtesan. So there's a physical man and a physical woman, and then another physical woman, the maid, in the background. And all three of those things occupy the same real space. I don't buy that. A big problem with why I don't buy that is because of all of this white space. That white space to me looks like a wall. The title of this work, and I am super cautious with referencing titles, but we understand that Paul Cézanne actually did title this work A Modern Olympia to be in conversation with Edouard Manet's painting of Olympia, so that's important. So, A Modern Olympia indicates the conversation with Edouard Manet. Edouard Manet was making a painting of a woman. All of this white business down here makes me understand this work as a male viewer who is looking at the representation of a female nude that is hanging on his wall. That is the thing that's modern about Olympia. Olympia is not a courtesan, Olympia is a painting. Cézanne was really interested in the physicality of the painting. He really liked how pigment sat on top of the canvas. What it was imaging was secondary to what it was physically constructing. And so in this volley into art history, what Cézanne is interested in doing is pushing that conversation forward and identifying what exactly was modern about Olympia. And it wasn't the fact that she was just looking out at the viewer, although that was shocking. It was the fact that it was rendered the way it was. It was flat. It was staccato-y. It was brushy. It was, all these words all generally mean the same thing. And so it's here that I want to start talking about Paul Cézanne, because it's from that specific attribute in early realist paintings like Manet, like Courbet, that Cézanne moves forward. The Impressionists go off in their own direction. Cézanne does something very different. All right, we're back. Excuse me. That's the beginning of Cézanne. The real thing that most people know his work, or the real way that most people know his work, is through a combination of still lives, like the one I'm showing you here. There's a few portraits that exist, but primarily it's still lives. It's paintings of one mountain, Mount Saint Victoire, and then these nude group figures that he was doing. And so we're going to talk about those three different groupings of works by him today. So, starting off with one of these still lives. This is a still life with apple and pears from 1892. This is when the artist has pretty much left Paris. He is living out in the French countryside in a town called Aix. And he was often referred to as the master of or I don't have any possible, or I don't know how to pronounce that. That's what I'm trying to say. Oops. Never have. I always say I. Anyway, so he's living out there. He's sending works back to Paris. He's showing work in Paris. People in Paris know who he is. He's still a very relevant guy on the scene. He just doesn't live there anymore. And what he's doing out in his studio in the French countryside, other than living a very bucolic life, is he's making works like this that very much reinforce the idea of the physical object of the painting. You can see in parts like down here and over here, the way that he's applying the paint or not applying the paint is indicative of how he wants the audience to interact with these things. In no way is he trying to convey a sense that these are real pieces of fruit. Instead, he's talking pretty specifically to other painters in France at this time and saying, we all know what Manet did, and so this is what a still life looks like after Manet. And so he's very, very much interested in making the audience constantly aware of the flat structure of these paintings. So yes, those fruits don't look as though you could pick them up and bite into them, but from a painter's perspective, they're very interesting and visually captivating things. He is often quoted as saying that the world can be broken down into a series of simple shapes, the sphere, the cube, and the pyramid, or the cone. And when he is rendering these fruits, he's thinking of them actually as little jars filled with pigment. And when you paint a little jar, there's a different weight and thickness to it than a solid piece of fruit. And that's what he was interested in, is getting this kind of radiant light that's not only coming from the edge of the jar, but also from the inside of the jar and what's being let through the clear glass. Does that make sense? So like holding up this thing, right? So you can see this glare on this cup. Well, that's from the outside of the cup. But if we turn it this way, the glare now is coming from the inside of the cup. If you do this with things inside of them, like if this was filled with orange pigment, which a painter would then use to mix with oil, which is binder, and then it would kind of have a variety of different shades and tonalities of light coming through the glass. That's what I mean. So, Cézanne, still lives. Oops. This is Mount Saint Victoire. This is this mountain that was nearby. It's kind of like when you're in Portland, you can see Mount Washington. So imagine if a painter every morning got up and made a painting of Mount Washington. Well, that's what Cézanne was doing with Mount Saint Victoire. He was getting up almost every day and making a painting of it. And not every day was a complete painting, but not every day needed to be a complete painting. Because for Cézanne, it wasn't about recording light. It wasn't about being in the landscape and capturing the moment that you're seeing things the way that it was for what's his name, Monet. We all forget names, everybody. Instead, it was about the construction of an image. And so when you see this work, one thing to note is look at how clean this line is around this mountaintop. You can see absolutely everything. These branches stop right before they interrupt the view of the mountain. Is that actually the way that Cézanne saw it? Probably not. But he decided that he wanted to show off the mountain, but he wanted the mountain to be framed, as it were, in these branches. And so he very willingly leaves this little margin of room so that the mountain has a little bit of breathing space before it hits the top of its frame. and then these branches just lead directly off of the frame and kind of extend. And so the idea is that you're looking through a thicket of branches as you look beyond them and see the mountain in the distance. One of the things to look at as well is look at the way that he's given us this architecture. We have this aqueduct that's pretty, that is pretty well defined right here. But for this building, what we have actually are it's just like a flat sheet of yellow pigment. So it's a lot like Olympia's body, which was just flat sheets of white pigment to indicate her flesh. He's just saying, like, this is as simple as I need to make it. I can actually use the color as a mode of architecture. It's one wall, and then we have this other color that presents the other wall, and those two things together give us a sense of gravity, of weight, of reality, in such a way that they prop each other up. And so that we have a complete building with roof because of just two flat planes of color. I'm being specifically a little bit didactic when it comes to this stuff, in that I'm explaining it a lot, because the next phase, the next lecture that we're going to have today is on Cubism and Futurism. And Cubism and Futurism hinge very, very much on the developments of painting by Paul Cézanne. So just keep that in mind. Here we have another Mount Saint Victoire, and this one is much later, as you can see, from 1904. And for this one, you can see that he's really ramped up that idea of the way he makes the marks. We have, again, these very, look at the patchwork that he has here. I mean, even this whole mountain is patchwork. The whole landscape is patchwork, right? And so, again, we have it is reinforcing architecture, but now he's moved on and it actually makes up the forests and such. And this mountain, I think, is quite lovely in the way that it is fractured. It looks like it's almost a gem, but instead of a gem reflecting just pure light, like think of a diamond, all the light that radiates out of there is like these little hints of color, but it's very much translucent. In this case, the mountain, the weight of it is reinforced by these tiny fractures in its landscape. And from a distance, that might be how you perceive a mountain visually, but again, for Cézanne, it's much more important that it is about the act of painting. What does it look like? What does it feel like to actually have the thing built out of paint? That's the important thing to take away from Paul Cézanne. Large bathers. The large bathers. This work hangs in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. I'm from the Philadelphia area, and so I have seen this painting since I was knee-high to a grasshopper. And when I was younger and not really that interested in art, I didn't really understand what the big deal was with this painting. Specifically, I didn't understand why that was so obvious. I also didn't understand why this part of this figure, these other light bits here, the majority of this person's back are actually unfinished. There's no paint there. That's the color of the canvas that's shining through. And so as a kid, I found this stuff and I was like, I don't understand how he didn't finish the painting. Why is it on a museum wall? Maybe he died? Actually, I think for a long time I thought that Cézanne had died before completing this work. And then I got into art and was really interested in this kind of stuff, and I had a professor that said, no, he left that empty on purpose, because he realized at some point while he was mixing his paint colors to try and get the perfect like peachy, like this kind of color, this glary color on my forehead, of Caucasian skin, that it was the exact same color as the canvas. And he was like, well, why? If my ultimate goal is to build a reality out of paint, and so therefore to reinforce the physical object of the painting, why would I bother putting pigment on the canvas that is the same color as the canvas? If the canvas shows through, then the audience is going to be that much more clued in to the fact that they're looking at just a pictorial construction. They're not looking at reality. They're looking at someone's idea of reality. And so for him, this work was much more about creating this cohesive, almost a masterpiece. And so he did deliberately make things, make the composition very almost classical, with this mass of people here, this mass of people here. Both of those things weigh each other, or they present a really nice counterbalance. And then this gesture, almost looks like you're inside of a church, with the steeples and the buttresses that fly over many cathedrals, many bigger cathedrals. Smaller churches obviously don't have that kind of architecture, but bigger ones do. And this was a deliberate move. Like I said, he wanted to make a masterpiece. He wanted this thing to be considered very highly, and to be considered not only as a good painting, but also as a historically important painting. It was important that he made something that answered a lot of the questions that he was interested in as a painter. How do you build something out of just paint? How do you make an object and something that conveys a certain sense of meaning? And so for this work, it's very much like Cézanne's Bonheur de Vivre, I think I just messed up that name. Matisse's Bonheur de Vivre, Matisse's Joy of Life. Because when we were talking about that work, remember, I was saying that, it's about this idea of the Arcadian landscape, where it's this fictive world where you get to just kind of hang out and have these bodies be naked, and have these people in this landscape, and have it not be, have it be free of the social constrictions that say, you have to wear clothes, you have to go to work, you have to do X, Y, and Z. Cézanne, like all of the other painters that we've been talking about, has really been looking at modernism and looking at industrialization in this very specific way, and it's a mode of critique. He's like, I don't know about these trains. I don't really know about these cities. He left Paris because it was too big, it was too much. He didn't want it anymore. He wanted a more rustic life. And he realized that a lot of other people were interested also in that idea. And specifically, there were people that were willing to buy paintings of those ideas. And so it's not surprising that you have this burgeoning urban middle class, but all of these middle class people actually want a little bit of a rustic landscape to go home to, or a rustic idea to at least, to play within their head, so that they can put aside the smoke of the trains or the noise of the city. They can actually just kind of look at this and imagine these lovely places. So there's lots of reasons why this painting happened. That's what I'm getting at. And next, I want to show you a detail of the unfinished parts. So you can see, look, when I sit back like this, if you look at my forehead, which is a weird thing to point out, but visual cues, right? You can see that, there's a dark part of my forehead here, there's a dark part of my forehead here, but then right there, there's this glare, right? If Cézanne was making a painting of me, this glare would be unfinished, just canvas showing through. And that is exactly what he did here, because right here, if you're actually modeling the human form, and when I say modeling, it's like if you take this coffee mug, so you can see that there's a shadow on this side, and it gets brighter on this side. That's what modeling is. It's the application of darker pigments, darker tones to indicate a three-dimensional shape. And so here, what you have is Cezanne indicating the three-dimensional shape of this figure's leg, but he's letting the highlights be unfinished canvas. I know it sounds really kind of bizarre, like why leave the canvas unfinished, but like I was saying before, he did this on purpose because leaving it unfinished reinforced this idea that he was making an object, that he wasn't necessarily all that interested in the importance of having this perfectly beautiful, perfectly rendered, perfectly academic thing like this work. You know, he has moved so far beyond the motivations that Ang had in making this work, and he is now resting on pretty much an entirely new mode of making pictures. So Paul Cézanne is wildly important. You know, he not only almost every museum in the world shows a Paul Cézanne painting. Collectors still vie for these works a lot. They will pay a lot of money for a Paul Cézanne. They rarely come up for auction because of how important they are and how rare they are. He did make quite a lot of work, but all that work is in private hands now. And in those private hands, those people don't want to sell it, right? It's an important thing to have. When he did pass away, there was a massive retrospective of his work, and that only reinforced how important he was to younger painters. One of the younger painters that he was very influential towards was Mr. Pablo Diego José Francisco de Paula Juan Nepomuceno, María de los Remedios, Cipriano de la Santísima, Trinidad Ruiz y Picasso. Straight up, that's his whole first name. That's his whole name, not his first name. His first name is Pablo, his last name is Picasso, and all of those things in between are his name. The Spaniards, you gotta love them. They want you to know exactly where they come from. They want you to know exactly their family lineage, and they put it all in their name. And if you've ever read most Spanish authors, not even necessarily from Spain, but people who publish in Spanish, will make some sort of reference to this kind of structure. I think it is a really nice thing, a nice way to introduce you to Pablo Picasso, because he's a guy who pretty much made his entire career in Paris, but he was always the Spanish expat in Paris. So there are certain times, and when we talk about art between the First and Second World War, I'll talk to you about the Frenchifying, as it were, of Pablo Picasso. But it is very important that you understand he was Spanish, and he was really into it. That was a thing that was culturally reinforced quite often. So, yeah, my hair looks crazy. Just FYI, I need a haircut. Oops. So, Picasso's La Vie. This is a work, obviously, from 1903. I told you that Pablo Picasso moved to Paris in 1899, and the book recounts the reasonings a perceived reason, why one of the first series of works that he made is referred to as the Blue Period. Gompert says that it's because Picasso was sad. Picasso moved to Paris with a very dear friend. This friend, within a few years, the pressure of the city had gotten to him. A failed love affair had scarred him, and he took his own life. And because of that, Picasso was plunged into deep despair. He was very sad, obviously. That's what despair means. And he began to make works that reflected that melancholy. And now, for those of you, melancholy is a term that gets used but is not really all that well understood. Melancholy is not depression, necessarily. Depression indicates this kind of, like, you can't get out of bed in the morning, you're just debilitated by the sadness. Melancholy, you can get out of bed in the morning, but everything you do for a very long time, like years, most of the time, is steeped in this sadness. You're just like, it's such a, you're just down. So that's one way of reading Picasso's blue period. That's what these things are called, these sad paintings. They're called Picasso's blue period because, as you can see in this work, but also in The Old Guitarist and the next work I'm going to show you, actually no, that's next. These are his blue period. They're marked by his use of a lot of blue pigment. As much as I think that there was a certain air of sadness in all of these works, not just because of the blue, but also because of the kind of stoic nature of these figures, the fact that when you look at their faces, there's not that much hope. This mother, even with the sleeping baby, this mother is not overjoyed. These two young lovers are not elated, even though most images, most depictions of young lovers are more from the beginning of Romeo and Juliet, not necessarily the end of Romeo and Juliet, and I hope all of you understand that reference. But look back here. We have this person who's crouched over in sadness, and we have this person who's crouched over in sadness being cuddled, as it were, by another person, giving them comfort. La Vie translates directly to the life, and so this is what Picasso is saying about his life in 1903, or life in general in 1903. It's tormented. It's sad. It's not gushingly sad, though. I mean, you don't have these people that are like weeping their eyes out. There's not, there's this level of like very calm understanding that things don't always work out well, that life is plagued by a sense of sadness, and that, for me, these two are the indicators here. You have these two people that are considering the weight of the world outside of them. If you take both of these people as being like two sides of Pablo Picasso's psyche after just losing his best friend, you can see that neither of these people are really, as I said, like ecstatically, emphatically sad, but they just have this kind of calm, yeah, that's life. It's like that's the motif here. It's not that, that's really it. The work is called Life, but you can also think about the play of words there, when somebody says that's life, they usually say that after your car breaks down the day that you're supposed to go to a job interview, or something like circumstantially awkward or a little sad, and so that is a very important play of words here from Mr. Picasso. That's life. It's sad. Kind of sucks sometimes, but that's life. Now, the next thing that happens to Pablo Picasso is he begins to make works that look like this. These works are referred to often as his rose period, indicating the inclusion of, rosy hues. He started using some more reds, he started using some more peaches, some more ochres, and began making works like this that arguably present the same kind of existential angst or existential consideration. These are not scenes of people being really overjoyed. They're not scenes of people being really sad. They're just scenes of people, these figures being very powerful. I will say almost every rose period Picasso is marked by an individual or multiple individuals that pronounce themselves with a certain air of dignity and to a certain extent, it is like this power of life. And this work, Boy with Horse, I'm showing you an image of it hanging in the Museum of Modern Art here in New York, just to indicate how large these things are. These Blue Period works are fairly small. They're not, they're a few feet by a few feet. They're not massive. When he gets to the Rose Period, he starts to make these much, much larger works. Now look, 1906, that's around the same year as the Fauves begin to show in Paris. It's around the same year that Cézanne's large bathers and a few other smaller bather paintings that look like Cézanne's, that look like the large bathers, those works were being shown in and around Paris. At this time, Pablo Picasso was being represented, or showing his work, through the gallery of Ambroise Voillard. It's a name you don't need to know, but it is a name that is referenced in our text. Ambroise Voillard was selling Pablo Picasso's blue paintings very well. There was a market for them. He's a very, very good painter, and a lot of people were very interested in the sentiment presented in those works. This sense of ennui, E-N-N-U-I. You should look that word up. It's a good word to know. But in the face of the work of Paul Gauguin's Tahitian paintings, which were coming back from the island nation and being displayed and sold in Paris, the work of Henri Matisse and the Fauves presenting a more exuberant sense of life, and the large, powerful, corporal, as in of the body, works of Paul Cézanne were also being shown. So these three different kinds of paintings were being displayed all over the place, and Picasso's dealer went to him and was like, maybe you should try and make some works that aren't so sad. I might be able to sell them a little bit more if they are a little bit cheerier, if they do appeal more to the variety of human senses, not just our sadness. Like, what would happen then? And so Picasso took the challenge, and he made a work like this. The Rose Period is fairly short. It's like usually marked from 1905, 1906 to 1910. And we're going to talk about Cubism next because that's his next move. But in 1906, he also made this work and a series of other works that are similar to this. Two Nudes is the picture. It's about the same size as the boy leading a horse. It is obviously comprised of two nude female forms. However, these two nude female forms bear a little bit of a biological realness, but not quite. Look at the way that the breasts are indicated in this painting. They look as though they are sculpted molds that are placed on another sculpted mold. Arguably, these two figures look as though they're built out of clay. They don't look like they're built out of flesh. They look like they are sculptures. And even if you look at the faces here and the back of the face here, these things are not necessarily representations of real female bodies or real female people. They are meant to just be these almost like nymphs of the painting, as it were. And this was the thing that really did mark this Rose Period. In the Blue Period, you have people that Picasso actually knew. This was, someone that he saw on the street playing the guitar, sitting down. This is a real life scene. He's getting a little bit more abstract, but these are still references to people that he knew in real life. Boy leading a horse, that's not a boy that he knows. That's not a horse that he knows. It's also not a landscape that he knows. It's a fictive place in the same way that Cézanne's large bathers is a fictive place. If you make up the place that these bodies fit into, you can then, therefore, make up the bodies. So, he's not interested in creating a form that's similar to a real human body. Instead, he's interested in making a form that's about painting a form. To a certain extent, he is here having almost a direct conversation with Paul Cézanne, and a little bit of a direct conversation with Edouard Manet, but I think that after 40 years, the Olympia thing has faded slightly in the minds of young painters in Paris. Instead, he is very clearly having this conversation with the other builder of the painted body, which would be Paul Cézanne. One of the things that is important to note here, and I brought it up a little bit with regard to the German Expressionists, but this inclusion of a different kind of face making. This time period saw a lot of artists going to museums that opened at the end of the 1860s, pretty much through the 1890s. They're ethnographic museums. Now, for those of you who've ever been to pretty much any art museum, they usually incorporate at times a very small or modest collection of of objects from sub-Saharan Africa. Sometimes they have large collections of these objects. The Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York has a very large collection of them. The Bates College, or the Bowdoin College Museum up in Brunswick has a small collection of them. So the reason why, however, they have these things is because around this time period, Western painters were going into these institutions, these ethnographic museums, and seeing what anthropologists had brought back from the field. And they were seeing things like this Fang mask from the nation of Gabon. And look at the way that this face is structured. So you have a very strong nose, you have this shape of eye that's not necessarily trying to indicate all the intricacies of this fallow and the shadow and my eyelid and all that stuff. And Picasso's following it almost to a T. It's like almost the exact same shape. He's doing this because he's actually in these spaces. He's actually seeing these kinds of masks. We know for a fact that this mask was in Paris at the time that Picasso was looking at this stuff. So there's a very good likelihood that this is actually one of the masks that he saw specifically. And here is a really good comparison with this painting by this one of the two nudes in the previous work. Here is La Demoiselle d'Avignon. This is a work that I do not ever translate. I don't know why. It means the women of Avignon. Avignon is a town in near the southern coast of France. For whatever reason, I don't know why, I will always refer to this work as La Demoiselle d'Avignon. If on the exam you write the women of Avignon, you will get credit for it. Don't worry about that. But I will always reference it as La Demoiselle. I just do. It's such an important painting. It's so influential. Picasso actually knew that it was so influential, and he didn't actually show it to people for quite some time. He finished it. It was in his studio in 1907, but by and large, no one saw this work other than close friends and confidants until probably about 10 years later. It was right around the breakout of the First World War that this work saw the light of day inside of a proper art viewing space. So, what do we have here? We have 5 female figures, all in a variety of postures, all kind of assembled together in an orderly, although chaotic, composition that involves quite a bit of fracturing space. And when I say fracturing space, I mean this kind of stuff. So what that is a curtain, this is a curtain, this orange side. This back area is, well, it is actually another curtain, we think. But it's just instead of having a flat plane, he's giving you a multiplicity of planes to give you the sense of architecture. In the same way that Cezanne was doing that for buildings, Picasso is here doing it for the shapes or the ripples in fabric. He's also leaving bits of the canvas unpainted. They are primed, that's why they're white in color, not peach in color, but they are blank. He's, again, following in suit with Cezanne. He's seen this work, he is familiar with this work, and he's very interested in how it operates. But so that's what I mean slightly with fracturing space. When we talk about cubism, I'm going to get more into that, but this is the touchstone. This is kind of the beginnings of what we're going to deal with in the next lecture. The other thing that is operating here are these mask-like faces. Now, a lot of times when people criticize this work, they say, you know, Picasso is defaming women. He obviously hates women. Yes, he probably did have an air of misogyny. You know, he was a womanizer and all that stuff, but it's not that easy. That's probably the best way for me to say it. The reason why these women all are imaged in different ways is because he's looking at a variety of different influences when coming up with how to make this painting. We have this is a mask that is similar to those found in certain parts of sub-Saharan Africa. This is a mask that is found in another part of certain sub-Saharan African nations. This, however, is a face that's very indicative of early European sculpture, i.e., around the time of Jesus. These very, very flat, very like frontal, big eyes, big nose. This was a motif that was big in early European sculpture. And Picasso's including it here to say that, I am looking at African influences, but I'm also looking at Western influences. I'm looking at everything. And what this painting is actually trying to say is, I'm looking at everything, I'm trying to put everything into one painting. And so, where Dominique Ang, Jean-Auguste Dominique Ang, had one woman in his Grand Odalisque, and where Edouard Manet had one woman in his Olympia, those two things made references to two different modes of painting. What Picasso is interested in doing in La Demoiselle is giving you 5 different ways that somebody can be painted. And so when you actually see this work in person, you will notice that all 5 of these women are actually painted in very different ways. He is trying to create a work of art that is as experimental as his penchant for making works can possibly be. He is literally trying to make a masterpiece. And he starts off with works like this, these people who are presented with a sense of pride and with a sense of authority, but also a sense of questioning. When I see 2 nudes, I always think that we have 2 different modes of painting that are seeing each other for the first time and trying to familiarize themselves with one another. So what would it be if you met a sibling that you had not known beforehand? How would that interaction go? You see, like, you're familiar because you look similar, but you operate very differently. So how does that change your interactions? And then you fast forward to this, or fast forward by a few months, and you get, okay, well, what happens if you have met 4 of your siblings at the same time? How much of a manic cluster would that be, right? This is the thing that Picasso was really interested in pursuing here. Now, I told you last week that I was going to reference this figure right here, right? This is from 1910. Picasso by 1910 had very strong connections with a German art dealer named Kahnweiler. It is very, very likely that this German art dealer had conveyed some sense of this painting, if not an actual image of this painting, to Kirchner, this painter, because you have this figure here, this crouching female in the center, and then right here we have this crouching female figure in almost the exact same posture. The fact that those two things have that kind of similarity, I strongly doubt is accidental. So, yeah. Really quickly, I just want to show you some details of the variety of ways that Picasso has made these women's faces, or these painted figures' faces. I think it's easier to see these as interesting icons in the history of painting if you think of them as painted figures, not necessarily painted women. Painted women implies the kind of misogyny that I was referencing before, like, oh, how can he say he loves women when he's representing them like this? But these women are like these figures. It's just about a nude body. It's just about a form to paint. He might not have even been looking at the human body at this point. He's thinking of them. And here, he's certainly not looking at a human form. He's looking at the way that different cultures have rendered the human figure, and specifically the human face. And so here we have three different methods for making faces in painting. And he's employing all three of them, mainly he's not saying look at the way that these three women look. He's saying look at the way that we can make these things. Look at the opportunity that is presented in painting. And so lastly, to close this lecture out, here is the demoiselle in its frame, just to kind of, again, reinforce the object of the object. It's a really incredible painting, and it is pretty much always on public view at the Museum of Modern Art, and it was recently restored, and so it is even prettier than it was the first time I saw it. And so if and when you are in New York City, I hope that you go to the Museum of Modern Art, because not only will you see this work, but you'll see lots and lots of other works that we talk about over the course of our term. So, the next lecture is on Cubism and Futurism, and that's going to be coming up in a bit.